Questions raised as the US Defense Chief Robert Gates toured India and Pakistan, pledging more support for both nuclear-armed rivals. With India taking a more prominent role in Afghanistan, will Washington live to regret fueling an arms race and further tension between Delhi and Islamabad? Or is it helping to stabilize the region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Imran Garda. The US Secretary of Defense Robert Gates has visited India and Pakistan for the first time since the Obama administration took office. Gates has applauded India's aid contribution to Afghanistan. He urged India and Pakistan to cooperate in fighting terror. Gates acknowledged that there is tension between the two countries, but encouraged them to continue their efforts in helping Afghanistan.
Let's be honest with one another here. There are real suspicions in both India and Pakistan about what the other is doing in Afghanistan. And so I think each country focusing its efforts on development, on humanitarian assistance, perhaps in some limited areas of training, but with full transparency toward each other in what they're doing would help allay these suspicions.
Well, the Defense Secretary warned of the wider ramifications of al-Qaeda activity in the region. He also praised India's actions after the Mumbai attacks.
I believe this operation under the umbrella of al-Qaeda, working with all of these different groups, is intended to destabilize not just Afghanistan or not just Pakistan, but potentially the whole region, by provoking a conflict perhaps between India and Pakistan through some provocative act or terrorist act. India had responded with great restraint and statesmanship after the first Mumbai attack. The ability of any state to continue that were it to be attacked again, I think is in question. I think I have to leave the answer to that question to the Indian government and its officials, but I think it's not unreasonable to assume that Indian patience would be limited.
Well, in a leaked report submitted to Barack Obama in August last year, the commander of US forces in Afghanistan said Indian political and economic influence is increasing in Afghanistan, including significant development efforts and financial investment. The Afghan government is perceived by Islamabad to be pro-Indian. While Indian activities benefit the Afghan people, increasing Indian influence in Afghanistan is likely to exacerbate regional tensions and encourage Pakistani countermeasures in Afghanistan or India. And there's a definite pro-Indian feeling within Afghanistan. Last week, a domestic poll showed that 71% of Afghans think India is contributing the most to the reconstruction of Afghanistan. Only 2% of the 1,500 people polled said they thought Pakistan was the most important contributor. The Taliban actually came higher with 3%. And the positive feeling about India is not without reason. India has pledged over $1.2 billion in support for projects ranging from education to road building and power stations. Well, to discuss all of this further, we're joined by our guests in Delhi, General Ravi Soni, security analyst and former Director General of the Indian Military Intelligence, and in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, Director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute, and we will get a Pakistani voice as well throughout the course of the program. If I could start off with you, Mr. Soni, what do you make of Robert Gates's trip in general?
I think he was positive in certain ways when he talked about the requirement for tensions to be decreased, but he was very realistic when he said that Indian patience would be tested very severely in case we have something like Mumbai again. That is something which I would say was a very perceptive thinking, and I won't call it a warning. I would say that it was something which was very realistically conveyed to Pakistan.
Mr. Weitz.
And so far as
sorry, Mr. Soni, please continue.
So far as Afghanistan is concerned, Well, we have always tried to play a constructive role, which is being done by the rest of the world also. And we do it because we want our near neighborhood to be stabilized and peaceful, because we have seen the consequences of instability in Afghanistan. We have seen the consequences of the elements which came about here in the 90s, and they had directly impinged upon our security and our stability. So we are concerned about this place, and we really want this place to prosper, and we don't want any problems to be created in this particular country.
Okay, let's go to Washington, D.C. and Richard Weitz. Mr. Weitz, is it a wise idea for the United States strategically to fund and to arm both Pakistan and India?
Well, I think the understanding is twofold, that with respect to Afghanistan, a long-term solution to the Afghan conflict will require a positive contribution from both countries. Pakistan, as we know, shares a lengthy border with Afghanistan. There are common ethnic groups that transcend that line. There's links between some elements in Pakistan with some of the Afghan resistance and forces, the insurgents, as well as other terrorist groups. So you need to draw Pakistan into a solution. And India, because we're not actually funding India. India is becoming a very wealthy country on its own through its domestic efforts. And that is part of that, the rise of India. It will play a greater role in contributing to regional peace and security, including Afghanistan. So the hope is, in respect to Afghanistan, there'll be harmony. More broadly, the administration, when it came into office, said that it wanted to promote reconciliation between India and Pakistan. But of course, very carefully, the Secretary appropriately said that the United States didn't want to intrude in the negotiations for Kashmir, for example, unless it was invited. But certainly, insofar as he can communicate messages when he travels back and forth, that's helpful. Next week's London's conference will be helpful. Both the representatives from India and Pakistan will be there, so we might see some mediation efforts offline. So I think that there's an effort both to deal with respect to Afghanistan and then more broadly to address some of the fundamental tensions between the two states.
Mr. Weitz, Robert Gates acknowledged that, quote, trust deficit with Pakistan. People by and large hate the United States in Pakistan. Gates called it an organized propaganda campaign. But when US drone attacks continue to kill civilians in Pakistan, when Pakistanis are on the receiving end of suicide bombings, when they didn't have any suicide bombings until they were drafted into what they feel is somebody else's war, it doesn't make it very difficult to understand why they might hate the United States and why there might be that trust deficit, does it?
Well, I would concur that there is a trust deficit, and the Secretary acknowledged that fact. Some of it is due to a bit of a misunderstanding. For example, the suicide attacks were prevalent in South Asia, particularly in Sri Lanka. That was something the terrorist groups used. So this is something that predates the heavy U.S. involvement there. That said, the drone attacks are a problem, and they're trying to address that by giving Pakistani forces the ability to address the insurgents and the terrorists based in Pakistan, so that the United States can reduce and hopefully at some point discontinue these attacks. For example, the Secretary gave the Pakistani government, they've announced they're going to give them 12 of their own drones. More broadly, the hope is that with the commitment on the part of the Congress now to provide Pakistan with over $1 billion of aid for the next 5 years, U.S. efforts to work more closely with the now a democratically elected government in Pakistan, to reduce some of the tensions with India, as we discussed, that there'll be a resurgence. Particularly, there's a concern, the Secretary mentioned that in the past we severed contacts with the military in Pakistan, and so he made a special effort to give a presentation at one of the main military academies there, and said that we're going to try and develop further exchanges and hopefully address some of these sources of tension and misunderstanding between the two countries.
General Soni, why do you think a stronger US-India and India-Afghan relationship, why do you think that upsets Pakistan so much?
I don't know really, because you see, supposing you make up your mind as the Pakistani military did, unfortunately, they started thinking about having a strategic depth in a foreign country. And some of an idea that a foreign country would be under their thumb as it was, and they would dictate their policies depending on the wishes of Pakistan. Now that, I thought, was something slightly less than mature. Because as you have said that, I am not being sarcastic about it. I really feel that Afghanistan can become an area of harmony if we join together along with the other neighboring countries to bring more peace and prosperity in that country.
Yes, but Pakistan is hardly at a very, sorry to interrupt you, Pakistan's hardly standing on a good footing with India. Isn't it fair that Pakistan feels squeezed strategically with Indian influence on the other side of the border, and the fact that there's never really been a long-lasting peace between India and Pakistan?
Well, you see, getting squeezed is a very psychological feeling, because in Afghanistan there is no military presence, and we'll be ridiculously stupid, India, if they would do that. So to feel squeezed just because there is a certain amount of economic aid there, and we are not a superpower in anything, and we don't have any pretensions of being a superpower, but whatever we can do with our neighborhood, we are trying to do in that particular country. To feel squeezed because of the, what do you call, development efforts we are putting there, I think is rather unfortunate. And that's where I say that if Pakistani can spell out their interests in Afghanistan in a very transparent fashion, so those should be taken heed of, and that should be taken heed of. But just to continue being suspicious of activities which are very, very transparent and open, that is something which is not correct. And so far as the tension between the two countries is concerned, well, we have reasons to be, what do you call, for our concerns. And Mumbai was just about a year and some months earlier. And even today we are having lots of inputs about the possibilities of some sort of a problem arising from those quarters. So that's what is our concern. And I think, but after having said what I have said, I think there is definitely in the government circle and in the establishment a feeling that whatever tensions are there, they should be decreased. But we are very, very realistic about it. The beginning has to be, and the opening has to be from both sides, actually, if you ask me.
Well, I'm lamenting the fact that we don't quite have our guest from Islamabad yet, because this would have been the perfect time to bring him in. Hopefully we do get him before the end of the program. We'll have to wait and see. But for now, let's just recap the historical relations between India and Afghanistan. As we said earlier, India has become a major player in the reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan. Now, this isn't something new. Historically, the two countries have shared close cultural and political ties. India supported successive governments in Kabul until the rise of the Taliban in the 1990s. It was among the first non-communist states to recognize the government installed by the Soviet Union after its 1979 invasion. Well, the Taliban took power in the mid-1990s with the support of Pakistan's ISI. India lost all influence in Kabul as New Delhi never recognized the Taliban government. Following the 9/11 attacks, India supported the US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. It provided intelligence and helped the US work with the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance. Ties between the two have been growing ever since. India has restored full diplomatic relations with Afghanistan. It has now 4 consulates across the country. India is now the 5th largest aid donor to Afghanistan. So it does really paint the picture, both past and present. Mr. Whites, do you expect that relationship to only get far, far stronger between India and Afghanistan, despite the fact that Pakistan may not be happy about it?
Well, I think that yes, that you'll probably see a continued deepening of economic ties between the two. That said, one of the main impediments to Indian economic contributions to Afghanistan is that Pakistan is physically interposed between them, and you mentioned the tensions. So some of the more creative thinkers are thinking about ways in which you could have, for example, oil pipelines or transit routes that would link Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and then on to other countries. And the idea there would be that you give people a common economic stake in regional security, regional economic development that would help, again, bring the countries closer. Conversely, because of the concerns that we've been discussing, the administration in the United States has been pushing for greater contributions and power in the end, but not combat troops. There's an understanding that that would be disturbing to Pakistan. So there's a hope to make it focus on the economic realm.
Mr. White's talking about things like pipelines. I mean, forgetting for the moment about the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, freedom, democracy, all those concepts, just divorce them from the issue for the moment. There's an abundance of natural resources in Central Asia. Questions about where pipelines go, who gets the contracts. Do we underestimate the geopolitical significance of Afghanistan and really why everybody's interested in the country?
No, I don't think so, particularly after September 2001 terrorist attacks. It just highlighted everybody's attention to Afghanistan and Central Asia. I would point out, we haven't talked about it, but the Chinese are very much aware of all these natural resources. And while the United States and the Western combat forces have been focusing on the military campaign, the Chinese have been very cleverly buying up great assets, such as the largest copper mine in the world and other developments. So at some point, there will be a major natural resource boom coming out of Afghanistan, which ideally would elevate the economic situation there, which is why the U.S. administration, although aware that this is an unequal, from say unfair bargain, the Western troops doing the dying and the Chinese getting all the resources, understands that that would actually help Afghanistan stabilize, at least in the near term.
Mr. Soni, let's move on to Kashmir for a moment. Barack Obama made some comments in the past 12 months which hinted at the fact that he might be interested in the United States becoming a broker between India and Pakistan over Kashmir. That's something that India won't like, is it?
No. I think it's a bilateral issue. And actually, as a matter of fact, as has been very categorically said by our Prime Minister, that there was, in the previous Pakistan administration, there was some progress, which was very substantial progress. And I feel that if both sides have a certain bit of understanding, and there could be a possibility of this particular problem being sorted out bilaterally. I don't think there is any, what do you call, a requirement, need or compulsion for a third party to enter into this.
But if the process is seemingly frozen and both are strong US allies, why not bring them to the table as a middleman?
No, you see, there is no requirement of a middleman. I think America is doing its bit by making encouraging noises. It is the mutual trust which has to develop, which is, what do you call, there is a deficit actually, if you really ask me. So, but I feel that gradually and slowly, probably, there should be certain amount of unfreezing of the, what do you call, the relationship, and at its own time, I think it will be possible. So it will be good if Kashmir is kept away as far as Afghanistan is concerned. But as you mentioned, I think Afghanistan itself can become a point of cooperation rather than contention, if you really ask me. Because stability, I think both countries, Pakistan and India, both are interested in having a stable Afghanistan. That's what we hope. So if we can join in along with America and the regional country and the other global countries to make sure, as a joint venture, to ensure that this country continues to progress as a stable country and it is economically viable. And as very correctly Mr. White said, Chinese are the ones which are investing in a big way as far as the natural resources are concerned. I also really feel that in India, our private, what do you call, investors should be able to go in. But unfortunately, the problem always comes of transit. The problem is always of the routes to reach this country, which are at the moment very circuitous actually.
Right.
So if everybody joins together, why should we not have joint economic ventures? Pakistan and India join each other to have joint ventures for economic development in Afghanistan.
Okay, before we wrap up, I'd like to actually finally bring in Ahmed Qureshi in Islamabad. Unfortunately, we would have loved to have had you much earlier in the program, Mr. Qureshi, but We're going to give you a chance here very quickly to just comment. I don't know if you've actually listened to much of the program so far, but by and large, both the other guests felt that Pakistan should not feel aggrieved if India and the United States have a stronger relationship, A, and B, if India has further influence in Afghanistan. What do you think?
Well, the history actually does not support this view. We've had once before a situation where India had extensive influence inside Afghanistan. That was back in the 1970s when the government in Kabul was very close to the Soviet Union, and later when Afghanistan was under Soviet occupation. And our experience at that time was that the Afghan soil at that time was used, and Kabul actually was used to put pressure on Pakistan. And in fact, one of the insurgencies that we see right now in our province of Balochistan began to take shape during that period. And it's history, it's a Cold War history, it's the past. It shouldn't repeat itself, but unfortunately, after 9/11, after India began to again reassert its influence in Kabul, we've seen the rebirth of those Cold War grievances, the rebirth of some terrorist groups that were based in Afghan back in the 70s that died with the death of the Soviet Union, but suddenly, mysteriously, they cropped up again after 2002. So we have a history that supports the Pakistani argument and concern that while India invests in the development of infrastructure in Afghanistan, which I don't think anybody in Pakistan objects to, but we don't want to see a repeat of a situation where the Afghan soil and the Afghan government is used to put pressure on Pakistan to settle what essentially are bilateral Indo-Pakistani problems, Kashmir and others.
Okay, and if I could try to summarize some of the other points, I'll put it all into one. One of them was that Pakistan doesn't really have a right to feel squeezed strategically by both India and Afghanistan. And one of the other points was that India in Afghanistan has contributed in terms of agriculture, media, infrastructure, all sorts of positive things in Afghanistan over the past 8 years. Pakistan hasn't seemed to have done too much.
It's not a question of Pakistan doing too much. It's a question of, again, in Pakistan, I don't think anybody in Pakistan is objecting to India contributing to the infrastructure, doing the good stuff. Unfortunately, the world media, and specifically the American media and the British media, do not really focus much on what we've been discussing with the Americans. Robert Gates, for example, was in New Delhi, and he came back to Pakistan, and he actually said publicly that he did discuss with the Indians, for example, the Pakistani grievances of Indian involvement in Balochistan. This is not a conspiracy theory. There's a lot of evidence on the ground to support it. This is not the place to discuss all of that evidence, but that's there. The Admiral Mullen knows about it. General Petraeus knows about it. That evidence has been shared, and it's there. And partially, the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh seemed to have accepted partially some of that evidence during the summit meeting between our Prime Minister and Mr. Singh in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt last year. So it's there. While India is doing the good stuff, I don't think Pakistan has any problem with that, but we have a problem when India tries to assert its presence in Afghanistan and use it in covert ways against Pakistan, which is happening, by the way. Some of the weapons that we found, some of the terrorists that we arrested on the border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, some of them really are not just Al-Qaeda and Taliban. Some of them have to do with some of the intelligence activities that are happening in Afghanistan. And while we discuss Afghanistan, let's just quickly remember that Afghanistan right now is a black hole for all sorts of covert activities that are besides the declared ones, the declared being, of course, against Al-Qaeda and Taliban, but there's a lot of other posturing and positioning that's taking place in Afghanistan, and we can discuss that later.
Okay. Apologies, gentlemen. And to the viewer, it was a lopsided discussion, but it was purely for logistical reasons. I'm glad all of you at least got your point across, General Ravi Saunhi, Richard Weitz, and belatedly Ahmed Qureshi. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us here for this discussion on Inside Story. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this episode of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments, your suggestions, or your questions. Email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.